Yeah, thank you, Professor Michael, for this very kind invitation. My topic is quite related to Paul's presentation, and this was totally unplanned. I was asked to talk about my current research at the Loyola Institute, and I'm studying the theology of Urs von Balthasar and the use of the concept of analogy, both in philosophical and theological questions. In this paper, I would like to argue that the concept of analogy is of primary importance for Balthasar. He helps us understand the numerous entry points to Christian revelation, including wonder, in addition to the theological center of the Christian life. Before I do so, let me provide some biographical information about Balthasar that will become useful later on in the presentation. The presentation mentions a couple of dates, important dates, but I'll be talking more about the paradoxical topics related to his method and to his life. He never obtained a doctorate degree in theology, and neither did he ever accept a chair at university, despite the numerous offers. Yet, after the publication of the Theological Aesthetics, the Hurley's Guide, he was considered one of the top theologians in Europe. He anticipated the development of the Second Vatican Council in his book, Raising Up the Bastions, but he was never invited to the council as a theological expert, despite many of his friends from the seminar in Lyon being invited. He was named a cardinal by John Paul II, but he died in Basel 2 days before the official ceremony. He dedicated his entire life to St. Ignatius and the Society of Jesus, but he left the society to start a secular institute with Adrian von Speyer. This was the most painful decision of his life. He left him without a bishop for a while. Like Henri de Lubac, Balthasar is a man who suffered from the church, but he ultimately suffered for the church as well. Now I'll talk about his understanding of the arts, because this will become extremely useful when I talk about the experience of beauty as a preamble of the experience of Christ. The arts were very important to him. His original studies were in Germanistics that included a bit of literature, German literature, music, theology, philosophy. His doctoral thesis was on the apocalypse of the German soul. He was a skillful piano player, a lover of the music of Mozart. His father was an architect. His best friend in Vienna was the Austrian psychiatrist Rudolf Adler. And he mentions being very fond of Matthias Grunewald's Crucifixion multitriptych. He loved literature from French Catholic writers such as Bernanos, Claudel, Peggy, and obviously Spanish playwrights such as Calderón de la Barca, all culminating in Dante and Wolfgang von Goethe, the most important intellectual for Balthasar. Now, his theology starts from the encounter with God and the experience of the gravitational pull of being in the beautiful, an experience that usually the arts describe, rather than the classical route to theology from philosophy. The experience of the artist, we could say. For example, in relation to Claudel, he says, and I quote, "No Christian philosopher, theologian, or mystic before him has experienced the horizon of the world so powerfully," end of quote. In a similar way, in relation to Mozart, he says, I quote, "Mozart serves by making audible the triumphal hymn of a prelapsarian and a resurrected creation, in which suffering and guilt are not present as faint memory, as past, but as conquered, absolved, transfigured present," end of quote. For Balthasar, every human pursuit of knowledge starts from an initial religious intuition, the fascination for life, everything created, a breathtaking landscape, the finiteness or fragility of our lives, the order of the universe, for the philosopher. They all produce a huge fascination for everything that exists. In this wonder, we recognize the fact that nothing that exists needs to, that our innermost aspirations do not finish in us, and that the stars of the sky point towards something even higher. In this double form of this medieval concept of the contingency, the fragility of life, the mysterium tremendum, and the superabundance of being, the mysterious fascinosum, we are confronted with the very mystery of being. We understand, although intuitively at first, that being also possesses a glory from God. It cannot in itself satisfy the natural yearnings of human beings. It is both marvelous and excess and vulnerability and dependency. Now let us look at the concept of analogy and how it relates to this fascination of being that I have described, an artistic experience, and that's why I talked about his artistic interests. Analogy stands ever since Aristotle for the affirmation of a similarity or proportion between two things in relation to a third thing, or a difference of another sort. For example, health and wisdom relate both to a perfection, although one to that of the body and the other to that of the intellect. As a preliminary definition of analogy, we can agree with the Fourth Lateran Council that define analogy as a similarity in a far greater dissimilarity. For example, we can say that the study of theology and philosophy are analogous, and by philosophy I include any other science. By this we mean that in both cases can be considered a science, a structured, a rational, methodologically coherent form of study. They have the same formal object, the ultimate cause of things, truth. However, there is a greater difference between the two. Theology deals with articles of faith, and philosophy with premises of reason. One starts from revelation of God, the other from the effects of the world, from the created world. Thomistic theologians distinguish some analogies that were used as metaphors, and these only implied an attribution. For example, the analogies used in literature. This is the common use of analogy in everyday language. We can say the mighty fighter is like a fierce tiger. This by no means says anything of a similarity in the substance of the two things. Each thing remains distinct in what they are, an animal and a human being. It only applies to their properties, their attributes of power, strength, and courage. Now, the other form of analogy, which is closest to the work of the theologian and to the theology of Thomas Aquinas, is that of proportionality. Aquinas reflects on the likeness between creatures and God, as it is described in the book of Genesis, where he says that we are created in the image and likeness of God. He says that there must be a true similarity between creatures and God, both because creatures are created by God and because God became truly human. However, God is absolutely transcendent, the total other. As Nicholas of Cusa says, the non-other. There is nothing creaturely in God. God is not a higher creature. It's not a better creature. It's something beyond our grasp. So as a result of an affirmation and a negation, Aquinas comes with an eminent conclusion, something of a middle way. Creatures who are finite and therefore contingent creatures participate in the likeness of God through the gift of grace. The real difference of God from creatures is the very same reason for the immanence of God in the creatures. Only the true transcendent God can create something different from him and yet proportional to him. And only the obedient creature that recognizes its limitations can give a space for God to enter. It can discover how God sustains his life. This is key to Balthasar thought, because we recognize the likeness of God in the very dissimilarity between the two. Now, Balthasar goes a step further, and he claims that Christ is a concrete analogy of being. This is what made Balthasar definitely famous. This means that Christ is the fulfillment and the foundation of the second analogy that I've described. The Council of Chalcedon explains that the person of Christ, there are two natures and one person. Christ was fully human while not ceasing to be fully God. Insofar as Christ is human, he is the analogy of God and creatures. In the incarnation of Christ, for example, God enters into likeness with creatures, but by so doing, grants in grace the possibility of elevating our natural condition to resemble more the life of Christ. Insofar as Christ is God, In him we encounter, unlike anywhere else, the full revelation of God, the immensity of the love of the one crucified for our salvation. And in this love, the immensity of his being, his simplicity, his perfection, eternity, and so on. So Christ is the key to Balthasar's doctrine of the Trinity. So in the person of Christ, the vertical and horizontal analogy are united. The horizontal analogy gathers the entire world of creation into himself, and the vertical manifests the Trinitarian life in his person. So in the Theodramatic, von Balthasar shows how Christ is the form and the norm of man and history, the model and rule for man on an ontological as well as on an ethical level. Obviously, the image of Christ cannot be looked upon in one gaze like a painting. His dimensions are infinite, and no finite spirit can manage to understand it. Nonetheless, Christ is form and image of all things, and as such, he remains infinitely reachable. The created world speaks, although analogously, about the life of God. Our lives give witness, although imperfectly, about the glory of God. And I quote, "What is called beauty in our created being is in consonance with the sublime attributes of the divine being that is known as glory." End of quote. Now that I have given a brief outline of Balthasar's understanding of analogy, let me return back to his life. This is the last slide, so don't worry. In my opinion, his conversion experience shows the importance of recognizing those moments when we experience a call to Christ in wonder, in amazement, or in many other ways. This, I think, is the experiential aspect of the analogy between creatures and God. In many ways, this experience provides a good introduction to Balthasar's theological method and is applicable to our everyday life. And here I quote his conversion experience in 1959. "Even today, after 30 years, I could still find again the tree on the lost path in the Black Forest, not far from Basel, under which there was a struck as if by lightning. It was neither theology nor the priesthood that at that moment appeared in a flash before my mind. It was this alone: you have nothing to choose, you are called. You will not serve, another will use you. You have no plans to make, you're only a small little tile in a mosaic that has long been ready. I needed only to leave everything and follow, without making plans, without wishes or ideas. I needed only to stand there and wait and see what I would be used for." And so it happened. The similarities to St. Augustine and St. Paul are striking. For example, let's look at chapter 9 from the Acts of the Apostle. I quote, "As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' Saul asked. 'I am Jesus whom you are persecuting,' he replied. 'Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do.'" Thank you, everybody, for your attention. I hope it is interesting.